So, welcome to our first video Q&A, answering your questions about Common Cause New York's national legislative priorities. To help with these efforts, we are starting a series of Twitter Q&A forums with your pre-submitted questions, with those that Common Cause believes are experts on these subjects. This is why we are so excited to welcome Stasha Rhodes as our first guest of the series to talk about the fight for DC statehood. Stasha Rhodes is the campaign manager of the 51 for 51, a grassroots coalition to make DC the 51st state with 51 votes in the Senate. She has combined the power of young advocates and national organizations to fight for representation for the 700,000 Washingtonians. Under her leadership, 51 for 51 has become a pioneering voice in the conversation to end the filibuster and frame DC statehood as a racial justice issue. Welcome, Stasha. I appreciate you coming here today.
Hi, Abby. Thank you for having me. Thank you for covering this issue.
Of course. So our first question for you today from our grassroots is, why do you want DC to become a state? What would it change for residents like yourself?
Absolutely. So DC must become a state because it is the most urgent racial justice and voting rights issue of our time. Over 700,000 mostly Black and Brown Americans are living in our nation's capital without voting representation in Congress. Our voices are being left out of crucial policy fights, whether it's gun violence, reproductive rights, climate change, infrastructure, so many other things. We are unable to voice our opinion and vote on these issues. Because DC isn't a state, Congress still controls DC's budget and has the power to overturn local laws. This has resulted in Republican congressmen overturning local DC laws on reproductive health, marijuana legislation, HIV needle exchange programs, and more. When DC becomes a state, we can finally claim control of our laws and live our DC values. We will receive equal funding from the federal government, which we have been shorted in the past, including in the CARES Act. We can have a vote in Congress about the issues that matter to us. And once it's a state, it will be the first state in history with a plurality of Black residents.
Thank you, thank you. So what's the current path for DC becoming a state? Do you need a constitutional amendment?
No, this is a common misconception about statehood, but we absolutely do not need a constitutional amendment for DC to become a state. In fact, on Monday, nearly 40 of the nation's leading constitutional and legal experts came together to send a letter to Congress clearly outlining that DC statehood is entirely constitutional. Just like 37 other states, DC can enter the union through what is called a joint resolution pursuant to the Constitution's admissions clause. We have a bill to make DC a state, the Washington, DC Admissions Act, that has already passed the House twice. Now all eyes are on the Senate to make DC the 51st state. And the only thing, which is super important, the only thing standing in the way is the filibuster, a Jim Crow relic that has consistently blocked civil rights legislation. DC statehood can't wait, so we have to bypass the filibuster to achieve our mission for civil rights.
Thank you. So next, what do you think of the option of parts of DC joining Maryland?
I don't think about it. It's not an option. An overwhelming 86% of DC residents have voted to become a state, and that's what we deserve. Retrocession is only furthering the more than 200 years of erasure of the 700,000 mostly Black and Brown residents who have their own culture, their own history. It would be whitewashing us to place DC residents in a majority white state. The people of DC don't want this, neither do the people of Maryland. And everyone who suggests this retrocession is violating our sacred American principle of consent of the governed. So it's not an option. It's not a thing that I think of.
Thank you. Next we have, how does the 23rd Amendment fit into this fight?
Yeah, I guess for quick background, the 23rd Amendment was passed in 1960 to give the residents of DC 3 electoral college votes so we could vote for president. The 23rd Amendment doesn't prevent statehood. Constitutional scholars agree on that. But when DC becomes a state, we will need to decide what happens to those 3 electoral votes, right? So HR 51, which is the Admissions Act, addresses that in a few ways, either by repealing the legislation that appoints these electors, thus nullifying the votes, or we can also assign those electoral votes to the winners of the Electoral College or the national popular vote. But if people take one thing away from all of this constitutional jibber jabber, it should be that the 23rd Amendment does not prevent DC from becoming a state, and that DC statehood is entirely constitutional.
Perfect. And then finally, we have, how can people get involved in your 51 for 51 campaign fight?
Call your senators, because we don't have any. Tell them that DC statehood is the most urgent civil rights issue of our lifetimes. And they need to pressure their colleagues to enfranchise DC residents, not next year or next Congress or 10 years, but now. 2021 is our year, because we can no longer wait. Tell your friends and spread the word that 700,000 mostly Black and brown Americans are living in our nation's capital without representation, and we need your support. You can also go to 51for51.org and sign up to receive updates on ways to act and take action in your state.
Thank you so much, Stasha, for your insight on these important questions. We really appreciate you being the first guest in this series. So everyone that's watching, look out in the future for more conversations about our legislative priorities. But to wrap it up, do you have any concluding words for our listeners?
I don't. I guess well, maybe I do. I just would say thank you for covering this issue. It's amazing to be the first in this series, the 51st state and the first in this series. So we appreciate that. And I guess parting words for DC statehood is that as the conversation around voting rights intensifies, don't leave DC statehood out of that conversation. So if we're talking about For the People Act, if we're talking about HR 4, the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, we should also be talking about DC statehood.